I've started the recording. Today's agenda, relatively simple, but important. We've gone through the welcome and introductions. I'm going to see whether, I don't think we have anyone who's not on the advisory committee, but we always provide an opportunity for public comment. Then we wanted to provide an update on the status of the project and just a little bit of an overview about the public outreach we've been working on over the last couple of months. And then moving on to the main event, which was reviewing the public feedback we've received on the discussion draft plan, and then moving on to thoughts you have, based on all this public feedback, any thoughts on refinements to the plan. And then we're going to wrap up and talk about next steps. Any questions about the general agenda? Okay.
Sounds good.
All right. I'm going to skip over public comment. And we always have this slide, project goals. They haven't really changed. Expanding opportunities for neighborhood serving businesses and housing affordability and choices are a key thing we're working on, and expanding opportunities for active and green transportation, and working on identifying strategies for community stabilization. Our project timeline, we're getting towards the end. It's taken a while to get through this timeline. You might recall that we released the discussion draft for the public to review on May 17th. And from May through July, we've been pretty active with trying to get the word out there about the discussion draft and to really solicit people's feedback. The next steps will be staff's working on refining the plan based on the public feedback. And of course, we want to hear what your thoughts are. And we're aiming to publish the proposed draft, which is what's going to be considered by the Planning Commission in late August. And right now we have a tentative date for a Planning Commission public hearing on September 26th. The session starts at 5 p.m. So that's where we are generally about the overall timeline. Any questions about that? And I can't see everyone. Oh, actually, Valeria, I think you've got your hand up.
Oh yeah, no, I was just gonna ask if you were all gonna consider having a couple of folks from this committee come and join you for that presentation, or if that's not the right opportunity to do that, because I know, yeah.
No, that's a very good idea. It's something we wanted to discuss when we do talk about the next steps and where do we go from here. But I think that's a good idea. We do sometimes have some invited testimony, like one or two people from an advisory committee who, after staff gives their presentation and before everyone else starts providing their testimony, provide that opportunity for testimony from the advisory committee. So that's definitely a good idea. I wanted to say a little bit about what we've been up to the last couple months. You might know that we had an online open house along with survey questions, and I think we had about 90 people respond. And we also have a map app tool online that's showing the draft zone changes. It's really intended to be a way for people to find out the details about what's proposed for their property. And there's also an opportunity for people to provide comments through that. We also had a virtual information session, sort of like a real-time online open house on May 24th. We had tabling at a number of community events and gathering places, including both the Lentz and Woodstock Farmers Markets, Mount Scott Community Center, Grocery Outlet, Mercado, and the SF Supermarket over by Foster and 82nd. And we talked to about a little bit over 150 people at those events. So it's nice to have that one-on-one communication with people. And then to really make sure we're hearing from a broad array of people in the community, we arranged for focus group discussions with people from the Spanish, Chinese, and Vietnamese language communities. So that's something we had been working on in July, and we will share a bit about that. And Hector was our point person without those discussions. We also had a project email where people submitted questions and comments. We had mailers sent out to owners of properties that were being considered for zone changes, and also all residents within 400 feet of those properties. Ended up going to almost 7,000 addresses. And we also had flyers at area schools and the Francis Center over near 82nd, which is a food and clothing pantry. So definitely try to approach community engagement from kind of a variety of angles here. And today we wanted to share some of what we heard, and we heard a lot, and then that's why we had sent you basically the full comments, including notes from the Vietnamese and Chinese focus group discussions. But today we don't really have time to go through every comment, but I wanted to just go through some of the highlights and major points we were hearing. And that's an image from the Lentz Farmers Market. And not going to go over this, but just to remind people about the land use proposals before we get into the comments we received, and propose a new neighborhood center down by Favela and 82nd, expanding business and housing opportunities, primarily on 52nd and 72nd, and as well as some other areas. But wanted to go straight away into what we're hearing, especially from the online survey. The first question is really about, what do people feel about this proposed new Brentwood-Darlington neighborhood center? And among the respondents, the vast majority supported the idea of this new neighborhood center. There was a smaller number of people who preferred just going for a small neighborhood business district rather than a full mixed use businesses and housing, and a much smaller number of people who wanted to keep things as they were. And we identified some key themes. They weren't necessarily something that we heard from the majority of people. In fact, a lot of people who responded to the survey didn't provide comments, and often people's comments were about specific concerns they had. But overall, a great degree of support for the proposed neighborhood center, especially the idea of having more commercial services. They like the idea of that center being a focus for some improvements for the area. The idea that they really wanted to see some street improvements in the area, but also a recurring theme was more trees and green elements. There were concerns about the impacts that new businesses and housing could have in traffic and parking. In fact, that was a recurring theme from a number of the feedback components we had, just support for the overall proposal, but concerns about things like traffic and parking. And there were also concerns about whether these new commercial spaces would be affordable, would they be able to support local small businesses, and that should really be prioritized. And as I mentioned, I think our discussion is going to follow Maya and Shane's presentations, but raise your hand or let us know if you have any questions about what we're sharing. Oops. Sorry, trying to get my slide to advance. All right, the second question was about the idea of a small commercial hub over by 82nd and Favela. That's an area that right now is just zoned for employment and light industrial, but it pretty much has small businesses currently. And there was a pretty strong support for 82nd and Favela becoming and being cultivated as a small commercial hub. There was also some support for more extensive commercial zoning along 82nd, and a much smaller number of people who felt it should just stay as employment zoning. So key themes, support for the commercial hub, but caveat some people had was we really needed to improve the street environment if we wanted it to be a positive place for pedestrians, and probably really that being a necessary component for a thriving commercial hub in that location as well. And there was some support for new housing opportunities adjacent to or sometimes on 82nd, and a number of people calling for really addressing traffic and safety issues in 82nd, and as I mentioned before, some interest in allowing commercial uses more broadly along 82nd. The third question was about.
Sorry, can I?
I have a
Just
question.
really quick on the previous slide, how does this align with, I know right now the proposal for 82nd from Peabody is more related to safety and yeah, and creating additional like safety features along 82nd, but is there a point where there, like I'm trying to figure out where there would be any sort of proposals around land use changes on 82nd, like which one would take, I guess, like not priority, but like would this be like, could you vote on this and then would that be changed if there are other proposed changes by Peabody, or which one takes precedent, I guess, if there are two different?
They're somewhat two different tracks because
Okay.
Peabod's work is focused on, my understanding is, transportation improvements or safety improvements. And there really isn't a part of that project that's looking at land use changes currently.
Okay.
And actually lower southeast, our area is the only place that's really looking at currently zone changes there.
Okay, great. Thanks for the clarification.
See, does someone else have a question? Moving on, there's a question about expanding housing opportunities and providing somewhat greater intensity multi-dwelling zoning over by the heart of Foster, over near Foster and the Mount Scott Community Center and near Lentz. And there was a good amount of support for those proposals. Some were saying it should expand those housing opportunities to even greater an extent, but also some who wanted to keep the existing lower scale multi-dwelling zoning that exists there. There were questions some were raising about, does it make sense? Is it worth it really to expand housing options, allow more multifamily if we can't guarantee that it'll be affordable? There's some concerns raised about the greater height allowances and effects on existing residents, and some express that the larger scale buildings should be directly on the major corridors. And again, concerns about the impacts of higher density housing on parking in the area. Okay, I'm going to move to the next slide. The next question was more broadly about expanding multifamily housing options on the major corridors such as 52nd and 72nd. And part of that also came with the idea of allowing small ground floor commercial uses on those streets. And here again, actually quite a bit of support for the project proposal. Again, people were chiming in about, if we're going to do this, we really need to prioritize this housing as it's affordable to working class residents. It should be affordable to people who are already in the area rather than catering to affluent people coming in from elsewhere. Concerns again about the impacts of new development on parking and traffic, and with the allowances for small commercial spaces, interest in seeing, can we prioritize small, local, and BIPOC-owned businesses? There was also a question about strengthening the small commercial hubs we have along the corridors. Here again, there was a support for the proposal. There was a goodly number of people who are saying we should allow more commercial zoning further along the corridors rather than just at the hub locations. And we're addressing it to some extent because the multi-dwelling zones on those corridors will allow at least small amounts of ground floor commercial, and then a smaller number wanting to keep the existing zoning. Again, concerns about the impacts the additional development could have in traffic and parking. And if we're going to be allowing more development, desire for street improvements to make it easier to walk and bicycle and take transit on those corridors, and a concern too about the displacement of current small businesses in the area.
Tim, want to pose your question?
Oh, I just had a quick one because I keep seeing it popping up, and I apologize if it's addressed elsewhere, but seems like people have real concerns about the affordability of housing options that might be built. And my understanding of the issues, that's not really part of what this plan is about, right? Because that's not addressed in zoning, right? The affordable housing is addressed in the actual building of the housing in the second step later.
Yeah, the greatest connection is that multi-dwelling zoning will allow more multi-dwelling type structures, which per unit tend to be less expensive than like new houses or new townhouses. So, by allowing more housing types, including multifamily, it'll allow less expensive housing types. And at least for larger projects in the commercial the mixed use and multi-dwelling zones, there are requirements for, if you have a building of 20 or more units, that you need to include some affordable units. But yeah, it is primarily really zoning map changes that we're proposing versus some more direct strategies for affordable housing.
Does that need to be addressed then? I guess I wouldn't want people to not be supportive of the plan because it doesn't address those issues.
It's kind of a two-step process. This project is proposing zone changes, and then once there are things like more allowances for multifamily, then it's working on more direct efforts with the nonprofit housing developers to actually get things built. We have some recommendations for community stabilization that call for things like working with nonprofit housing developers, and maybe seeing if we could have a tax increment financing district or an NPI that could provide additional funding for things like affordable housing and community economic development. But yeah, I think basically it's a two-step: zone changes first, and then seeing how you could deliver on affordable housing. And I see Nick's got his hand up.
So I agree with everything that Bill said about just allowing more multifamily is going to be the housing that's most affordable to people that are below 100% of median income. But there's also a lot of data that just building more housing of all kinds increases affordability, just because when you've got such a shortage of housing, it means people with more money can outspend people with less. So I think there's a lot of benefits to increasing the density and getting more housing built.
Thanks, Nick. I'm gonna I just want to remind people that we're going through first the online a survey we had, but we'll be saying a bit about what we heard from the focus group discussions and the map app afterward. And I'm going to be turning it over to Shane about the transportation parts of the questionnaire. Shane, anything you wanted to say about our proposals before we launch into the responses? And I'll forward slides as you ask me to.
Yeah, this is just a reminder of what basically the questions that follow are responding to. So I think we can go to the next slide. Thank you, Bill. So in the transportation section, we also asked 5 questions, and they pertain to different parts of those recommended projects for the most part. The first question was about the corridor improvements, and we're just asking if folks felt like these recommended projects would meet the safety, walking, and biking needs on busy streets in the area. And the majority of the folks who responded to the survey agreed that they did. There was a lot of support for bike lanes and for crossing improvements along these corridors. There was specifically, well, all across the planned district, there were support for reducing traffic speeds, reducing traffic volumes on neighborhood streets, improving walkability along corridors and crossing streets. And those digging into sort of the open-ended answers about, or from those who sort of disagreed with the statement that this proposal sort of meet these needs. They were worried about the bike lanes causing loss of parking in areas where parking is already pretty difficult, or they just felt like bike lanes don't really belong on these busy streets. So those are things to think about. Next slide. And then our second question asked about sort of the other side of our recommended projects, the neighborhood greenways, and it asked a pretty similar question about what they would be like for local streets. Would they meet the needs for safety, walking and biking on the neighborhood streets in the area? And there again was generally support for the series of improvements that we are recommending, especially at crossings of busy streets where these neighborhood routes cross busy streets. Folks are really interested in seeing crossing improvements. So that's something good for us to know to focus on when we implement those. And those are really key elements of neighborhood greenways, is those crossings of busy streets. There was also seen to be a need for improvements to just, many of these neighborhood greenways are along neighborhood streets that have really poor pavement quality. And so folks just wanted us to note, hey, when you put this neighborhood greenway there, you really need to pay attention to the quality of the pavement. Otherwise, this facility really isn't going to be really safe or comfortable for all ages and abilities. And then again, we heard about traffic calming and cut through traffic. And so just being aware of that, and not just on the neighborhood greenways, but neighborhood wide. And that's something that I think other than the why are you building more housing and without sort of parking minimums, this comment about traffic calming was probably the second most frequent thing that I heard. Next slide. The third question we asked was about whether folks felt like, okay, say we live in the universe where we've built all these projects on top of what's existing. Does this future complete network provide safe and convenient access to the places that people need to go by walking, by rolling, by biking? And again, folks who were taking the survey mostly agreed, though there were kind of a curious number of folks who were or more neutral on the answer to this question. And so we dug into some of the open-ended answers to the question. And so overall, there was that support, but people were really worried about the implementation of specifically some of the bike improvements on busy streets. We're just wanting to make sure that those were actually safe, some kind of physical separation between bike lanes and car traffic on busy streets. And again, that sort of concern about speeds, traffic speeds, and finding a way to keep those low enough that it still felt safe to bike on these busy streets or even the neighborhood streets. And then, I mean, again, one of the reasons sort of this whole planning effort was kicked off was because of sort of poor local street pavement quality, lack of sidewalks. And so people raised that as something that, hey, don't forget kind of why you kind of initially came here, why we kind of asked you to come here. It's to address this. So make sure that you're addressing this. Next slide. Then the fourth question we posed was sort of about approach. So say, yes, we have the right set of projects. If these are the right projects, then what sequence, where should we put our focus? Because we don't have the money to sort of do this all immediately or right away or at the same time. And so I actually had a pretty mixed series of preferences expressed. Most common was to fill the gaps in the neighborhood greenway, but second most common was that we should sort of proceed along improving both neighborhood corridors or those busy streets, sorry, not neighborhood corridors, corridor improvements, the busy street and neighborhood greenway sort of in tandem, move together in tandem. So this kind of mixed response is something that we need to sort of continue to think about how we'll move forward. Next slide. And then the final question we asked was about transit. If you'll recall, we worked with a consultant, we worked with you all, we worked with community members and TriMet to sort of develop a plan for how we can improve transit service in the area. And things people were looking for was just the bus didn't come often enough. It didn't really connect to places people wanted to go. And so we developed a series of recommendations. And then TriMet just so happened to have their own sort of system-wide planning effort. And as a result of that system-wide planning effort, they were able to bring in some of those recommendations. And so as a result, there were a few recommendations that they weren't able to adopt. And so we asked the question, hey, are these recommendations worth continuing to sort of pursue with TriMet? And we got a pretty lukewarm answer on that. There was, most people were kind of neutral, and of those who weren't neutral, more people said that they weren't worth pursuing. But that's often the people in the room on questions of transit are not necessarily the people in the room who would stand to benefit from that service. And so it's something that we also have to think about when looking at these results. Valeria?
I'm wondering if the recommendations from TriMet, are those recommendations made just based on data of like potential ridership and things like that, or like what are some of those recommendations based from?
The
Like-
recommendations that we made to TriMet or that TriMet sort of is implementing. They're kind of this kind of Venn diagram situation.
Yeah, I guess the recommendations that TriMet is not including, what was, I guess, some of the reasoning behind that?
I think some of our asks were required them to put more resources into an area, and their plan was kind of a short-term revenue neutral, so they weren't adding any resources. They were just kind of shuffling things around. And so they did actually, if you're just looking in the box of this area, they did actually add more service to the area, but system-wide, they didn't add any more service. It was just that the way that they chose to, we had specific sort of requests for what would be ideal for this neighborhood, but they have to kind of balance that with the rest of the system, because once a line leaves the neighborhood, it has to go somewhere. And so in working with their service planners, there were just a couple of proposals they weren't yet comfortable with the idea of. I think this one, the north-south bus service on 72nd Avenue, we worked pretty hard with them to find a route for that bus, and they weren't comfortable yet, especially without having resources to add. So I think it was a little bit of discomfort with the proposals and a little bit, we don't really have the money now, but come back again, which is why we asked this question, is like, should we continue to be persistent with TriMet about this, or should we kind of just let it go?
That's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, Shane, in many cases, they did kind of met us halfway. Like there isn't currently service on 72nd, but part of the new TriMet system plan includes service that goes at least from Herald over where Mountain Scott Community Center is and down south to Faville and 72nd. So it's not entirely continuous, but more than there is now.
Yeah. All right, I think that's it for the transportation side.
Yeah, I'll take over. We had one final question about whether what the plan is proposing, do they feel it's going to really help to address the plan's objectives? And those are the ones we went through before about expanding neighborhood business and housing opportunities and active transportation. And these are the responses we got. The majority of people felt that yes, the proposals were contributing to meeting those the plan's objectives, although it was somewhat lukewarm. I think a greater number of people felt that they were somewhat delivering on the plan's objectives. And I think where the major caveats were is that there really appears to be general support for the zone changes and the transportation improvements, but especially for the land use changes, just a lot of concern that the zone changes alone will not be sufficient to really deliver on the plan's objectives for affordable housing or to ensure that we have good community supportive economic development. And I have to say they're probably correct. Zoning just by itself isn't a guarantee that those things are going to happen, but it is a necessary first step. And again, concerns about the lack of parking associated with new development. Some were raising concerns that, well, it makes sense to focus on the corridors and greenways, that people still had interest in improvements to local streets and sidewalks. Some would point to other neighborhoods in the city that all have sidewalks, and we're still lacking that here. So that those are amongst things that came up. So really, I think bottom line for many people is the general direction they support, but they're really interested in the details of implementation and really how are we going to guarantee that what we're aspiring to is going to actually happen. Any question?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, is there an underlying in the city, because it says that it has that it pays attention to the elders in the city, there's it's kind of a program about that. So is that sort of an underlying value? Because I don't see that we are really, in what we're talking about here, that, that we're really taking care of the older people in our community very well. Concerned about them getting from here to there, making them feel guilty for having a car, and that's the only way they can get there. I'm just wondering if we are paying attention to the huge population that is, we've been told there'll be 300,000 people over the age of 65 in the Portland metropolitan area by 2030. So I'm just wondering if that's an underlying value that's being taken into consideration as we do these things.
Yep. I would say it's an underlying value. Our comprehensive plan calls for really having Portland be a city that works for all ages and abilities. And of course, the devil's in the details. How do you deliver on that is going to be a continuing discussion point. There are requirements, of course. Transit is going to have to be accessible, and there are special programs for people to call up vans to get around. But we'd be interested in any thoughts as to whether what's proposed in this plan gets in the way of those who have mobility impairments or have to get around by cars. At this point, we're not proposing actually to remove parking. Those questions that come up when you actually look at the implementation, but I'll let Shane respond to that as well.
Sure. Like Bill said, the all ages and abilities sort of policy, like there's an all ages and ability policy, and then it also informs all of our thinking about how we design the active transportation improvements, the things for people walking, rolling, biking, taking transit. So the term we throw around and that we use sort of as our design metric is 8 to 80 is sort of the demographic that we're trying to design these facilities for. And I also hear what you're saying about, well, I'm not going to, by and large, I'm not going to walk, or I'm not going to bike to the grocery store. I'm not going to take the bus to the grocery store. I'm going to drive to the grocery store. And so on sort of the other side of that, what we're doing for folks that are driving, that is specific to all ages and abilities driving, which is not really a thing that we talk about. But one thing we do is we're making the street more predictable. We're slowing things down so that reaction times, folks who are older have often slower reaction times. And so slowing down traffic, but also making things more higher visibility, making things more predictable. You know where people are going to be crossing and you can see them before you get there. It's things like that that help make driving safer. What we found in research with PSU is that a lot of these improvements that are sort of branded as bicycle and pedestrian and active transportation improvements actually make the street safer for everybody. And so a lot of these projects sort of, you're right that there's not a category of projects that we're proposing that's like specifically for younger people or for older people, but they are tangentially beneficial to basically everybody in different ways.
See, Tim, and then Anna and Valeria have their hands up. Tim?
I wanted to ask a little bit along those parking lines, and not, I mean, I understand that people are concerned, obviously it's a constant theme here, but like from PBOT and BPS's view, like how do you address people's concern about parking in those things? Because, if you're going to be zoning and having these developments, don't developments have certain parking requirements unless they get a waiver? So I don't, to me, it seems to be something that people maybe need to be more educated about what this means for parking. And that I assume that part of this is just this fear of not being able to park in front of their house when they want to, when I'm not totally sure that that's what's really the result of these things. So I don't know how you get people to change their minds about things.
Yeah, it's and just so people are aware, there have been recent state mandates about eliminating, reducing parking requirements because in many cases, parking, especially for higher density housing, does add considerably to the cost of housing, and housing cost has been a big issue in the state and in Portland. So people can include parking, but currently it's not required. Yeah, it's also related to some of our climate action goals. The idea is that over time, we don't want to be in the same situation we are now, where most people are having a drive, and we do want to make it easier to get around in other ways. But not an entirely complete answer, but basically it is fairly voluntary whether or not builders provide parking, and they usually do for townhouse type development. Anna.
Yeah, along those lines again, it's like, I think what I hear from those questions, about the parking and about the elder, also the affordable housing question and the higher density, I feel like there is a lot of cultural change that is coming. And I was just wondering, because there is an educational question associated with that. And how is that going to be transferred in, from the zoning code, where you can't answer those specific questions? But is that planned, that we have this kind of cultural discussion of how that will translate into the building code without having just an aspirational building code? I remember that Marty Stockton told me that when I moved to Portland, that a lot of those, comprehensive plans are kind of vision plans, and they are more aspirational, and that you have nothing that you can really implement from those things. So I wonder if we can have a little bit better understanding, from what I see, what's happening already with the higher density. The solutions that are being put in place are not really well thought through. So I wonder if there's, some kind of next step in mind.
Yes, you bring up good points about, we could change regulations, but changing culture is not so straightforward a thing. And whether government can do that by its own, it's probably not the case. And I think a number of the things that are proposed in this plan are intended to make it easier to get around in other ways, because we've heard from some people, for example, that they have to drive because there's nothing close by to go to. And we're trying to provide opportunities for more local services, and then with the active transportation improvements, making it easier to get around in a place where the infrastructure up to now has not been very good and has not been a very attractive a proposition for people to walk in many cases. So I think in many ways our project's more about facilitating getting around in other ways. It's not banning auto use or really eliminating parking on streets, but it's more about how do we make it easier to get around in other ways, or have more places locally to go to. See, Valeria has her hand up.
I was just gonna say what you just said, Bill, that I mean, if we have to be offering folks another accessible and enticing option to get around, to support some of these sort of cultural shifts or habits. I was wondering if it's part, I don't know if this is too much into the weeds, but there was a lot of support for building sidewalks. Is like right-of-way acquisition something that's going to be feasible to support some of those sidewalks in the neighborhood, or is that something like TBD?
So yeah, that's a good question. So by and large, we don't have to acquire right of way. A lot of what looks like people's front yards is actually city right of way. So that is a process where we don't just come and sort of bulldoze their front yard. We talk with them and we try to work with them to first help them understand that situation, but then also try to come up with treatments that do as much as they can to provide what we need for the street for public safety, but also sort of let folks have a front yard that house has probably had since it was built 60, 70, 80, 90 years ago. So there's not a whole lot of right-of-way acquisition for that we'll need for a lot of the sidewalk proposals. There's like sidewalk info proposed on 52nd and a couple spots on Flavelle Drive, and that's all city right-of-way already. And then internal to the neighborhood, that's a similar story as well.
Okay, thanks so much.
Kathy noted in the chat that she lives over on 72nd near Flavelle, and that the parking in front of her home is often taken up by people going to the nearby food carts. So currently some competition. One thing I should mention, although we're not looking at a requiring or acquiring additional right-of-way for sidewalks, when redevelopment happens. So like if there's redevelopment on 72nd and someone's wanting to build a business or mixed use project, there are requirements for sidewalk improvement. So along with development comes requirements for the wider sidewalk and space for street trees. So that's one way some of the change would happen over time. I'm going to move on to the next slide, and I want to be sure to get to just more of an open discussion of your thoughts based on what you've heard and what you've read, because we have not been able to go through all the comments people have provided today, but your thoughts on what jumped out at you in terms of maybe potential refinements to the plan. But let's see. Just wanted to share some feedback, and this was primarily these are from the focus group discussions. These notes were focused on the Vietnamese and Chinese language focus group discussions. Generally, people were supportive of the land use proposals. Again, concerns about about new development bringing more traffic and there being insufficient parking. And similar to what we heard from others, are wanting to ensure that if we're going to provide opportunity for more housing, that it really should be affordable to lower income people. There was agreement that the corridors and neighborhood greenways were we identified were really in the right locations. When we had asked them about prioritizing improvements on corridors versus greenways, it was split between those who are saying we should prioritize the busy streets because that's where the greatest need and the most people are, versus saying it should be both improvements on corridors and greenways that should be priorities. There were some concerns that were coming up about the bike lanes and busy streets causing the loss of on-street parking and maybe, and if it reduced traffic lanes, causing more congestion. And with these groups, they actually did like the idea of having bus service in Flavelle connecting all the way to I-205 where the light rail station is. That's one thing we heard. And we're still waiting on the notes from our Spanish language discussion. We were working with Latino Network on that. Hector, anything you wanted to say? Was there anything where the Spanish language discussion was kind of departing from from the feedback we were hearing?
Bill, so last Friday we have the focus group with Latino Network. There was about 7 participants. All of them have families living in the area. They were very excited about seeing a plan coming into the neighborhood. I'm very supportive of it, and especially on the transit updates and the transportation upgrades and safety in the area. Like the others, one of the main concerns were how to keep the existing affordable housing in the area, how to make sure to keep the prices affordable for the families who are already there. And even when they were supportive of having commercial in the area, there was a concern about the school in the area and how these businesses can imply safety issue for the students walking in the area. But other than that, they were very supportive. They're excited to see more housing coming in. They would like to see an effort to preserve the cultural aspect in the area, not only to see commercial and housing coming in and better transportation facilities, but also having a social gathering place, or like a cultural center. So not too different for what we're seeing right now.
Any questions about that before we get into the group discussion? Just wanted to add one quick note about our map app. Surprisingly, perhaps the majority of comments we had about the map app, which is kind of focused on the zone changes, was actually about the need for people are specifying places where they felt some street improvements were needed. There wasn't a lot of pushback to the zone changes proposed for specific properties, just very little. There was one individual who was feeling that in these clusters over by Chavez and Holgate and 52nd and Holgate, that rather than zoning to R2.5, the townhouse zone, that we should go to multi-dwelling zoning, but that was one person. So yeah, we didn't have a whole lot of pushback. There were a couple people who live on 72nd who were concerned about the upzones and what would it do to their current situation, whether it would make the home improvements they're considering worthless because it's just going to be their property will be good only for redevelopment, or concerned that developers are going to pressure them to sell their properties. But not, despite the fact that we sent notices to all the property owners who could be affected, not a lot of response to the zone change proposals. With that, I was going to stop sharing my screen and just open things up to people's thoughts on what we're hearing from the public feedback, and any ideas you have for, or any of these really begging for changes to our proposals. So again, I was noticing that it just did appear that the majority of people, especially for the survey, were in support of the proposals, but I'm interested in your thoughts about the details and especially some of the individual comments. Or is it good to go? Just package it up as a proposed draft and send it off to the planning commission.
I was gonna say, I'm still worried that the purpose of the plan is not like this is, I mean, that's what it is. It's a plan. There's no budget. There's nothing attached to it. They're not going to start building homes right away. Like this is it's like a goal almost. And I think people can get kind of bogged down in some of the details really critical to themselves, which I understand. I mean, it's human nature, but I mean, it's just an idea for how to grow the neighborhood over the next 20 years. We're not, a lot of people living here might be gone by then anyway, and I don't know how that's all in the context of how you read it, right? And I don't know how you write the plan to make it, to give that to people when they read it. They may just never read it. I don't know.
It's a good point. I do want to stand up for the plan a little bit. It's already actually doing what we hoped it would be doing, which is basically drawing attention internally to the city. And I've already found a couple of opportunities to get things funded. Just because I have a plan now and people are like, hey, you did a plan, right? I need to fill some crossing gaps in the citywide walking network. Do you have a couple crossings for me? I'm like, yes, I do. This one and that one. And because we talk with community and we prioritize them into tiers. So it is kind of, you're right, that is a plan and there's no money, but it's like step we have to take before we get the money, and stuff is already sort of starting to happen, even though it's kind of behind the scenes. So point taken that I think, and an earlier comment, I think he also made that we need to do a little bit of education, maybe, and just sharing about sort of what is next. That's a section, I think, of the plan, at least I know on the transportation side, that's missing. There's no sort of like, what's next? What can you expect to come of this? And I think that might help a little bit.
Yeah, I think there's a community stabilization section in the plan that speaks to some of people's interest. So it identifies, the need for some community economic development to, support small businesses in the area, and approaches to bring more resources to bear for affordable housing. So at least that's highlighting some next steps, and the idea of having a city plan that does that is something that can be returned to, and that the community could advocate to as well. And you do also have the advantage that you do have the 82nd Avenue plan, the Build a Better 82nd happening, and I know community stabilization's been a topic with that as well. And I like to see like this potential new neighborhood center as a key part of the housing strategy for the broader corridor. But I know it's Anna, you have your hand up, and then I think it's Scott and Valeria.
Yeah, I really like the plan, and I also like to hear all these different multi-layered feedbacks. So which speaks to that question that people do understand that there's a really large scale where they say like, yeah, that's fine. And then you get to that point where you realize, oh my God, that also means it changes in front of my door. And I feel like this is something that I really like in this process, that we have the possibility to address both scales and everything in between as well, and to hear from people. And I really hope, I mean, Shane, you just said it, the educational part, right? What is the next step? So it stays so abstract at this point. And I think what's really needed is to keep this kind of communication with the community about those questions. What do you really need? What does that mean? How did you understand what that plan actually proposed? And so I think, educational things are important, but also having some ideas out to just plant ideas into people's mind of how they can develop and how they can use their neighborhoods might be really helpful.
And I noticed Kathy's raising her physical hand, so I'll be sure that after Scott and Valeria that Kathy is able to share. Scott.
Yeah, thanks. I'm also very much in favor of everything I'm seeing around this, and what I've been surprised by very pleasantly has been the housing first sort of approach that this entire process and group has taken, and appreciate everything that's been done around that. It's more progressive in that direction than I'd originally anticipated. If there's anything further we can do around that, I think we should push it in that direction as well. We've got in this room a bunch of really smart, dedicated people to the neighborhood that are doing exactly that work. And so I wanted to make a comment as well about giving this group that's right here kudos. You were saying this is our the 12th meeting of these. That is a particularly long process. And with that, the good ideas that have come through this with what I would call very long-term vision about housing and what needs to happen, and dedicated community members, that my hope is that we can all continue to do this for better or worse. We're some of the neighborhood champions going through this entire process, and on the side, everyone's really nice too. And so it's made for these gatherings to be productive and enjoyable spaces. And so around this plan, some of the final things is getting some help from the city about what do you think our next step should be? Should we be, how do we continue as a group to push for these and be, I hope, continues to be as housing forward as possible, because that's the biggest issue that we are facing that is affecting the issues of displacement have to do with housing. And so I want to give the thumbs up around everything related to that this has done so far.
Valeria.
Scott, yeah, I'd second everything Scott just mentioned. And I would also say that to me, the plan looks great, and it doesn't only align with the goals that we have as a city for division on economic development and housing, but to me, it's also very much aligned with the city's own climate change plan and our priorities in that plan when we're putting forward some of these ideas for implementation. I think the plan lays a really good, and that's what it is, right? Like a really good foundation, or like the skeleton that is then sort of providing direction on what it is to come after. And that is a long way. And actually it's exciting that 82nd is going to have some funding. And so if anything, let's look for opportunities to kind of start prioritizing where we could, how to say it, like where we could be involved in some of those opportunities and just be smart about when that's coming and leverage basically maybe like other initiatives or other things that are happening, and how those initiatives with funding potentially can be aligned with what this plan is supporting. So
and then Kathy.
As Tim was saying, maybe I'll be dead before this plan happens, but I just want to point out that I don't see a lot of protection for homeowners that exist, especially on 72nd. My land will be commercial according to if this goes through, and my neighbors, I've talked to my neighbors about it. Nobody's thrilled, but I told them that it's pretty much the only way the city wants to move forward to get any money in the area is to promise commercial, and that it's pretty much being rubbish stamped every patch of the way. So I've kind of given up on making any difference. If this develops, say, like if it were wildly successful and develops like on Hawthorne around the 30th to 50th, I'll be forced out of my home essentially. There'll be no parking, or I'll be right next to a 4 to 5 story building like they build on Woodstock. I think Anna mentioned one of this before. They actually managed to build 5 stories instead of 4 due to some loopholes. And they'll either be looking right in my bedroom window, or something will happen. There's no tear down, there's nothing. I think this plan does not do enough to protect existing residents. I've said it before. Like I said, I know everybody's excited about more money, more this and that, but for me, I just leave these meetings feeling more and more depressed every time I come, and I feel like I've made no difference. So that's that.
Ouch.
Thank you. Thanks, Kathy. You've definitely been heard, and staff has discussed this, and we have been try to be fairly conservative in how much commercial mixed use zoning we do or propose, or how much 4-story zoning. We're trying to keep it fairly limited, but definitely understand your perspective.
And I think this ties in well with what Anna's comment was, which is people were supportive of this at sort of a broad scale, but when you get down to what does this mean for me, or what does this mean for people who are in these areas where the zoning is changing, that's another conversation that we need to sort of continue to have, and we need to listen to what you're saying and what others like you are saying, Kathy. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, it's these zone changes are always very much way into the future in terms of how much time it takes for things to change. Like one area that's kind of one of our emerging commercial main streets is Northeast 42nd, so the edge of Cully and Concordia, kind of north of Prescott. And it's got such a mix of things. I think they've had commercial zoning for decades, but if you were to go there, you've got a mix of older 1 and 2 story, mostly 1-story commercial buildings, some residential, but there's some change, but it's so incremental. It's not like some of the very hot neighborhoods, when you're talking about that sort of middle band of neighborhoods like Cully or Montevilla or Brentwood Darlington. I see that And Tim and then Nick have their hands up.
Yeah, I just wanted to apologize, Kathy. That was not my intent of my comment about there. And what I appreciated is that you do need to have that voice, because none of these things are set. I guess that's what I was going to say, is like the changing of the zoning doesn't necessarily mean that 72nd is going to turn into division. I mean, I think there's still a lot of, kind of what Scott was going to, is there's a lot of neighborhood communication and effort that will need to happen in the next 10 years to kind of develop the neighborhood and how they want to do it. It's not fait accompli that it's going to be a Hawthorne or a division. I mean, so I would hope that people of all views continue to speak up,
Nick, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to, second a lot of what folks were saying, that I really support the plan. I think it's important that we have the increased density and, we have a shortage of tens of thousands of units across the region. And we need places to put that housing. And if we get stuck on maintaining the status quo is that we have thousands of people who are houseless and living on the street. And that's one of the reasons I think it's really important that we, adopt things like are proposed in this plan.
Thanks, Nick. We have about 15 minutes. I just definitely want to provide space for other thoughts on the plan. And also feel free to email Shane or myself if you have thoughts. If you're reading through those very detailed comments people provided and you have some eureka moment, definitely let us know. We really appreciate just the amount of thought that people put into things. That we have 35 pages of comments that we shared with you, and in fact we're adding some more that we had missed. But really appreciate the attention people provided to the plan and the thought they put into some of their ideas.
I'm still kind of on this idea of opposing views, and this cannot be the first area in Portland or first project where it's gone with this kind of zoning change. And I'm curious if there's experience in the past about how those things were addressed in other neighborhoods, or what's been learned in terms of the best way to move forward with those things.
I've never participated in a plan where there's 100% agreement by everyone as to the way to move forward. So, there's always some balancing and, figuring out what are policy priorities, what are the most important things to address. So, it's always a constant balancing act. And there's some things we built into the code, like we have some requirements that 4-story zones, if they're adjacent to lower density zones, that need a step down in scale to provide some transition to the lower scale housing. So there's various things that we've worked into the way we do things that try to balance the differing priorities. But yeah, this plan is not unique in terms of not having 100% agreement on things. I think, Valeria, you probably had some experience with Planning and Sustainability Commission. In fact, I think in some ways this is perhaps less contentious than many plans we've had. So I was actually kind of surprised that there's as much support as there was in some of the survey things for the proposals, because we are proposing a fair amount of change, and yet there was support for that overall direction. And a thing, at least in some of my conversations with people, was there's also an educational aspect as to what zone changes mean. Some people were concerned that if we change their zoning for their house, their property, that they would have to make changes to their property. But zone changes don't trigger any sort of requirement. You know, if you're in a multi-dwelling zone and you have a house, you can keep your house and you can expand your house and do everything you would want. It's more that there are opportunities to do a bit more than had been the case with single dwelling zoning. You know, someone could have more units than otherwise. So I think, yeah, that concern is something here, that is this something that's going to force people to do something, force a change to their house, and that's not the case, and that's allayed some concerns. Of course, you can't allay all concerns about, well, what my neighbor might do. That's always there.
I would like my neighbor to finish the renovations on his house.
Yeah. You know, I think there are also positive things that communities can do. Just last week, I was at what they call a summer night event at Park Rose, on the Park Rose Main Street area in Sandy, where Historic Park Rose, which works on a small business development, sponsors a kind of a pop-up market, just as a one-day event with stands, little commercial vendor things, and music, and things for the kids. And yeah, something like that is within the realm of possibility, say in this emerging neighborhood center. If you could maybe do something with the school to have some event that gets people thinking about how this could be a hub for the community. And you know, you could have things that support home-based businesses being able to have a more public presence, like in an outdoor market type event. Hillsdale, they have their farmers market in Reiki Elementary's parking lot. So there's just, you know, one thought, you know, if you're trying to cultivate a neighborhood center that's a hub for the community, are there opportunities to work with, you know, businesses with a large parking lot or the school to start having people, by having an event that allows people to really vision the place being more of a hub for, you know, local businesses and community activity.
Yeah, I wonder along those lines if there are possibilities of, you know, finding out what people in a certain neighborhood might be interested in, because I hear a lot from our neighborhood association that people voice those questions and say like, oh, I would like to have this here. How do we attract certain things to happen in our neighborhood? And also if the city has a possibility, once you know, identify some of those things, if you could implement programs that would support certain, you know, small business developments in a specific area.
Yeah, you know, those are good questions. And, you know, we had recommendations about, you know, having something that supports some of the community economic development in the area. But I think more needs to be done to make it a reality. Or, you know, can you connect with the Black Futures Farm and some of the other agricultural things, you know, that maybe they could have a presence at a market. But yeah, this area has, I think, more opportunities than many that I've worked on. You know, this new neighborhood center not only has maybe, you know, potential for businesses, but it has a school, which is a real community anchor with Whitman and you know, Favell Park that's right there. So you have some of these civic anchors together with what could be a commercial hub for the area. So, you know, I think, you know, it's not going to be, 72nd will never be like Woodstock. I think we're looking at maybe 2.5 blocks of potential commercial mixed use zoning versus like 8 blocks or more on Woodstock. But, you know, it could be at least a small hub for the community, and you already have some anchors there. I'm going to talk some about next steps if that's okay. So I'm going to share my screen again. 1 second. Oops, how did I get back there? 1 moment. Just going to our last slide in terms of next steps. So I already mentioned we're going to be refining our draft plan, you know, based on the community feedback we've heard, And we're aiming to release the proposed draft in late August, and we'll be sure to let you know. Planning Commission hearing is on September 26th, at least penciled in now. We don't know when the project will go to City Council. I suspect it's going to be not till early winter or so, because it often takes a couple months to get through Planning Commission, or it has in the past. One thing I wanted to check with the group about is a couple things. One, ideas as to whether people in our group would be interested in having kind of a high profile sharing of what came out of the advisory committee during that Planning Commission hearing on the 26th. I think I was mentioning that typically the way we do the hearings is staff will provide a presentation on the proposal, and then we sometimes open it up to community partners to provide some testimony up front. And I think having one or two people from the advisory committee could be a good idea, like Valeria is mentioning. And just to hold the thought, because I'm going to stop sharing the screen, whether or not there might be interest in some final project advisory committee, at least informal, maybe social get together, perhaps in the community, because I think this is probably our last formal meeting. After this, we turn the plan over to the Planning Commission. So this is probably it, but it could be nice to meet somewhere in the neighborhood and at least be able to chat about things over some food and drink. So I'm going to stop sharing. So two things, ideas related to having someone from the group provide testimony up front at the Planning Commission.
Yes.
So sounds like Valeria is in support, and this is something we could email about. So I'm going to follow up with you all about that. I think it would be a really good idea, because we have worked so closely with community. We want to highlight that the community voice, and especially the advisory committee, has been core to the way we've looked at things. And one thing that's definitely the case with this project is we were not responding to any mandate. There was no requirement to do anything in this area for the most part, especially for land use, but really trying to respond to community's interest in really strengthening the area in terms of its what's positive about it. So let's have an email exchange later about that, and Pam might plant the idea, especially since Brentwood Darlington has been so core to what we're looking at. If you would consider having some role in that, something to
yes,
consider.
that's actually why I have my hand raised. I'd be particularly interested in commenting, if you think it's appropriate, on the community stabilization aspects that are mentioned in the plan. I'm fine with the plan overall, but sort of urging the Planning Commission and eventually the City Council to address things like the Neighborhood Prosperity Initiative possibilities, or tax increment financing, or focusing on anti-displacement through the Brentwood Darlington Community Center and Impact Northwest. So all of the things that are mentioned in that section of the plan are sort of near and dear to my heart.
Great to hear that. So we'll be in communication about that. And Valeria, I should ask you, do you have any connection with the Lentz Neighborhood Association?
No, I don't. I know when they meet, but I'm not part of it.
That's one group I think I want to communicate with more. And we are not really proposing much in terms of zone changes, but part of that 82nd and Faville zone change would be in at least the eastern side of 82nd would be in Lentz. And there are also some proposals by the Springwater Corridor to rezone to open space for habitat restoration. Probably not especially controversial, but it's probably a good idea to check with them.
Are they active right now? I remember a little while back there work meetings that were happening.
That was one of the things that I wasn't clear about. I sent an email a while ago and I never got a response, so I figured,
There was a whole turnover of the board.
right.
Yeah, it's I was talking to Matthew Williams about that, and you know, it's especially for land use, they haven't been really had a group that's looking at that, and so he wondered, well, maybe the East Portland Transportation and Land Use Committee could be a good one, but East Portland has been mostly focused on east of 205, so that may not be the best place, but I'll look into things. So the other question was about the idea of some entirely voluntary social event somewhere in the neighborhood. And no obligation whatsoever, and whether people choose to drink things, there'll be no official city blessing of anything. All right, looks like there's interest in it.
Sure.
Do we would someone be willing to, maybe choose a place and potentially a date? Scott, any thoughts on that? You raise your hand first.
I normally would be all over that. With a newborn, I don't know how much I want to try and do much party planning right now. Something right in the middle of the project area, I would think would be a good spot. I'm a little more on the western end of it, and I like Mary's is great, and there's the Misdemeanor Meadows is great, but like that's not in the core area of it. And I think we should meet a little more core if possible.
Like Rockies or something?
Like Rockies.
Well, we can usually get space at the Brentwood Darlington Community Center, but then we would need to bring in food or drink.
Well, let's maybe you should put the word out there and see if there's some consensus, and maybe Rockies is it. I've never been there. Is that a place that typically has space?
And food.
Yeah, they have food. I mean, I guess it depends on, I've only been there one time, and you can, the grocery outlet lets people park there. It's kind of an unspoken agreement, and the parking lot is really small, but yeah, like it's just across the street to the grocery outlet. And I guess it depends on the day and time for, when people go. Yeah, but how many are we, like 20 or so or less, fewer?
I think probably less than 20.
Yeah, so
regularly attend.
I think it's just worth it giving them a call, and they could just reserve us a few tables.
Yeah.
We should also make sure that people are comfortable being in a booze spot, if that's going to be one of the things.
Yep.
Maybe we should send an email out, make sure folks are comfortable. If anyone's not, then let's do community center or something like that.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
My first choice is for booze. I need a beer
Maybe
after all this child rearing.
You could put a few options for place and date. We could do a little Survey Monkey thing, perhaps.
And I think that would make a great way for us to continue organizing as well, and make sure everyone's got information shared, and then reaching out to folks that aren't able to attend that, and keep an inclusion for folks that still want to be a part of this whole process, because it's not going to end as soon as we stop meeting.
Scott, I don't know if this is your first, but you haven't lived until you have to get up at 3 a.m. hungover to change a blowout.
I haven't lived yet. I think I've been close to that.
Well, Scott, regarding parties and crowds, I found, at least I've had a couple little ones, and there's a certain stage early on where they'll often sleep through activity. So you might still be in that little grace period anyway.
That's true. And they also get you out of anything. You can just, they're a built-in excuse. So you don't have to say anything other than, yep.
Right. Okay. Well, thanks everyone. So I've heard, I'll follow up on the idea of people from the advisory committee being first up for testimony, and of course, anyone can provide a testimony on the plan once it's before the Planning Commission. And we'll also follow up on an informal get together somewhere in the core area and maybe look at some potential dates. So I think that's it. I think we're right at 8 o'clock on the button.
Great.
Well,
Thank
thanks
you.
everyone. Again, thanks for being sticking with us for all 12 meetings and 2 years of effort. So that's pretty amazing. Really appreciate it. Give yourselves a hand for what you've been doing.
Well,
right.
also hands to their staff and project leaders.
Yeah.
All right,
Really great
thanks.
work.
Yeah.
And we've been passing the
Thank you so
baton.
much.
So
Yes.
I know. I know.
right.
No,
Well,
really great.
if we have any get together, I'll have to invite Marty and Brian.
Yes,
Yeah.
please.
They
Definitely.
got us to where we were pretty in a critical way. Well, again, thanks for everyone. Thanks everyone. Thanks for sacrificing prime time for this event, and we'll be in touch.
All right. Thank you.
Thank
Right.
you.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Hi, all. Good job. Appreciate everything.
Thank you.
Bill, did you see my direct message comment that I left early on?
Let's see. Did I?
Like one of the very first ones.
I may have missed it, but I should look at the chat. Oh, let me stop recording, by the way.
Good.